He disappeared into the archives of the Cold War until one quiet street in Milan gave him away. Before we begin, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments, do you believe a false identity should protect someone from crimes committed decades earlier? Now let's go back to the moment a single misfiled document cracked open a life built on a lie. January 14, 1998, a narrow apartment on a quiet street in Milan clicked shut as a frail hand drew a curtain. Inside lived a man who had been presumed to have vanished in the fog of Cold War defections and purges. A man whose name no official list had kept, but whose fingerprints on paper had once ordered interrogations and deportations that echoed through prisons. To his neighbors, he was Giovanni Moretti, a retired language teacher who walked slowly to the cafe each morning. To a small team of operatives and legal experts on 3 continents, he was Viktor Markov, a Soviet-trained interrogator who had supervised cells, trained others in extractive techniques, and who had long ago slipped into a new identity supported by forged identity papers. This is the story of how a discrete archival detail, patient analysis, and an undercover operation converged to expose a life of concealment, and how that unmasking led to a trial whose ramifications crossed borders and tested the chain of custody of historical evidence. The ordinary face of Giovanni Moretti hid a bureaucracy of harm. He taught grammar in the mornings, hummed while reading the paper, and drank strong coffee that left a thin ring on his saucer. Yet documents from closed archives, witness testimony collected decades later, and a handful of weathered memos suggested a different past. A man who had signed memoranda authorizing transfers, who had sat in windowless rooms where names became numbers, where coordinated logistics turned human beings into cargo. We will show the files, the travel sheets, and the logistical notes that tied a methodical bureaucrat to the machinery of repression. We will follow the agents who refused to accept comfortable explanations, the analysts who pieced together identity papers and travel logs, and the precarious undercover work that finally led to confrontation on a Milanese sidewalk. This account rested on archive boxes, witness interviews, declassified cables, and the testimony of survivors who remembered a voice that demanded compliance. It is not only a tale of espionage and audacity, it is a reckoning with how procedural efficiency can mask brutality, and how international law wrestled with the imperative to extradite and prosecute in a world where records were scattered, rat lines were woven, and identity could be manufactured. We will reconstruct the operation, the capture, the legal battle about jurisdiction and admissibility of evidence, and the verdict that followed. We will also listen to survivors and to prosecutors who insisted that documents and witnesses must be enough to break decades of impunity. Now imagine a quiet street in Milan, a pale balcony, and a man who believed himself insulated by a new name. We will trace every step that unmade that illusion. He was born Viktor Anatolievich Markov in a steel town on the western rim of the Soviet Union in 1949, the son of a railway clerk and a schoolteacher. As a child, he learned to listen before he spoke, to find silences in the noise of crowded kitchens. He spent his summers collecting scrap metal with his father, and his winters memorizing dates in a room warmed by a single radiator. In school, he showed aptitude for languages and for administrative detail. His notebooks were precise, margins ruled, and his handwriting clean. At 19, he was recruited into state structures, not for frontline service, but for clerical efficiency and the ability to remain unreadable under pressure. Those early years shaped a man who equated order with safety, who trusted procedures more than people, and who believed that bureaucracy could be a shield. The cadence of his youth returned in later years. A neatly folded scarf, a penciled grocery list, the habit of checking doors twice. The transformation from clerk to trainer came gradually. He attended courses in interrogation techniques under instructors whose names surfaced later in fragments of testimony. He was sent to regional centers where he learned to coordinate transport, to log detaining movements, and to draft memoranda that became operational blueprints.
Friends remembered him as distant but reliable, a man who lent books and never asked personal questions. Loss and repetition hardened him. A brother dropped from a railway accident, a brief arrest early in his career that left him wary of suspicion. Those losses fused with training and produced a practiced calm, a professional who believed in systems and who learned to render moral judgment into boxes on a form. It was that same capacity for procedural thought that later helped him bury traces of his identity under layers of forged documents and steady routine. By the late 1970s, he had risen to a role coordinating interrogation teams and overseeing transfers between detention centers. His title on internal lists was never sensational. It was administrative, a functionary in a larger apparatus. He drew up schedules, approved transport manifests, and signed off on requisitions for cells and interrogation rooms. He did not wield the tools himself with theatrical flourish. His was the more insidious authority of approval. Archives later showed signatures and stamps in his hand on documents that mandated deportations and prison transfers. Paper after paper revealed logistics, train times, vehicle allocations, lists of detainees moved under code names. Colleagues named him efficient, exacting, the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice when a stamped order moved people like pieces on a board. These administrative details were crucial. They revealed a chain of decisions that allowed systemic violence to operate under the guise of routine. Inside the operative mind of his superiors, the calculus was chilling in its mundanity. A transport memo might read like a timetable.
Requisition might note the need for additional sleeping space on a date that coincided with mass transfers. The language of the documents was bureaucratic and thus deceivingly bland: lists, columns, checkboxes. Yet victims later testified about nights of loading and the smell of diesel, about the rust of barred doors and the metallic taste that came with fear. The archive preserved the memos. Survivors preserved the memory of voices that called names for departure. Together, they mapped logistics to lived horror. Sensory details knitted the files to flesh: the clack of train tracks, the tang of disinfectant in corridors, the dimness behind cell bars, the rasp of names being read, and the taste of stale bread. For investigators, these sensory echoes gave the papery lists a human weight that made accountability possible. The mosaic of evidence began to emerge not as a single revelation, but as patient accumulation. Ilana Katz, an analyst based in Tel Aviv, found a discrepancy in a batch of travelogues that suggested an unrecorded transit through Italy. David Levy, a field officer, cultivated sources in Sarajevo and later in Rome. Marco Rossi, an inspector in Milan, noticed a pension application with contradictory dates. Elena Bianchi, a custodian at an Italian state archive, unearthed a bundle of shipping manifests cataloged under a misfiled code. Paolo Conti, a retired courier, remembered delivering sealed envelopes to an address that matched an alias used by Markov. Each thread was fragile alone, but together they formed a pattern. The case hinged on paper, on marginalia, on a watermark, and on the collapse of a forged narrative. The investigation unfolded across offices and cafes, through dim reading rooms and brightly lit safe houses. Analysts compared stamps, cross-checked handwriting, and matched travel itineraries to passport entries. Forensic document examiners tested ink and fiber. Mossad analysts worked with Italian magistrates to map routes and possible rat lines. The operation required legal scaffolding, evidence collection that respected the chain of custody, requests to extradite or to share intelligence, and careful calibration to avoid violating sovereign procedures. The question loomed: how to move from archival identification to a lawful capture that would result in a trial rather than a diplomatic stalemate. At this point, we pause to acknowledge what viewers may feel. The files and the facts provoke an emotional response, and that is legitimate. What stands out most, bureaucratic coldness or the apparent ease with which identity could be manufactured? What disturbed you more, the memos that planned movement of people or the calm routine that allowed brutality to be administered? Share a short thought below. Do you think paperwork can be as culpable as a weapon? Your perspective matters in this conversation. Commenting helps researchers and storytellers understand which angles resonate and can shape future episodes on how states and agencies pursue historical crimes. Now, we return to the narrative to see how a small misfiled sheet and an offhand remark from a retired courier cracked open a long-preserved secret. Tension rose in the first decisive moment when a marginal note contradicted a sworn statement. The note was small, a pencil jottings in an archive box, Cambio 1276 via Milano. The clerk who had written it, decades later, told a journalist he had meant only to record a route change. But for investigators, that scribble connected a transport to Milan at a time when the protagonist was listed as present in another region. This contradiction forced the team to re-evaluate travel logs, to reopen sealed files, and to seek witnesses who might corroborate a cross-border movement. The tension came from the possibility that everything would remain a matter of interpretation, that a single unexplained entry might never be enough to compel legal action. Investigators waited for corroboration, and each passing day risked evidence decay. The team felt the pressure physically: sleepless nights, the metallic tang of instant coffee at the desk, the ache behind eyes strained by microfilm light. The decision to pursue the lead despite the fragility of sources was the hinge upon which the operation turned. As documents accumulated, the picture sharpened. A network of rat lines used by agents and sympathizers provided passage and shelter. Identity papers were forged with stamps that matched official seals. Passports were purchased through intermediaries who charged modest fees and promised plausible cover stories. The protagonist had become Giovanni Moretti in a sequence of transactions that included a forged birth certificate, a pension claim, and letters of recommendation from a theatrical club where he taught languages. In Milan, he integrated slowly. He rented a modest apartment, joined a chess club, and took classes at a community center. He kept his head down and let the city's rhythms mask him. But small anomalies persisted. An occasional Russian phrase on an odd grocery list, a postcard with Cyrillic handwriting, a photograph in an old album showing a younger face with military bearing. Each anomaly was a thread that investigators tugged, not by force but by patient unpicking. The second moment of tension occurred during surveillance when an informant contradicted an operative's timeline. Paolo Conti told Marco Rossi that he had once delivered a sealed packet to the corner of Via Solferino and had seen a man who matched the description. The operative David Levy had daytime photos that showed Giovanni at a cafe. These timelines overlapped imperfectly. Had Markov been in two places at once? The team had to reconcile human memory with photographic evidence, both fallible in different ways. The struggle became not only about locating the man, but about proving continuity, that the person behind the alias had the same administrative habits, the same physical idiosyncrasies, the same scars. The tension compressed into a few weeks of staking out schedules, listening to cafe conversations, and matching an old scar on a wrist to a surgical note found in a hospital record. The stakes were legal as well as operational. If they could not link identity with sufficient certainty, extradition and prosecution would crumble. By late 1997, Mossad analysts had crafted a dossier that used documentary evidence, linguistic analysis, and a chain of small human recollections to argue that Giovanni Moretti was Victor Markov. Linguistic markers were subtle, a pattern of pronouncing the double consonant in Italian in a way common among Slavic speakers, a particular preference for phrase structure that suggested early Russian schooling. The dossier included a chain of custody for each document, photos cross-referenced to dates and cafe receipts, and statements from 3 witnesses whose memories converged around a single figure. With this, Mossad faced a choice: inform Italian authorities and risk losing operational control, or act in a way that would secure physical custody of the suspect while preserving admissible evidence. The plan to identify and apprehend the suspect combined legal finesse with undercover tradecraft. Ilana Katz coordinated the analytical backbone, David Levy led the field team, Marco Rossi provided local law enforcement cooperation, and Anna Petrova, a survivor who had long campaigned for accountability, served as a moral compass and public face to the allegations. Additional support personnel included forensic document analyst Paolo Ferri, safe house coordinator Sara Benami, and legal advisor Judge Riccardo Moretti, who acted on a consultative basis for procedures in Italy. The team established surveillance patterns, monitored the suspect's routines, and set up contingencies for evasion. They prepared for questions about extradition and for potential diplomatic fallout. They rehearsed the capture that aimed to be swift and evidence-preserving. The capture sequence became the third peak of tension. On a rainy morning, the team converged. Cameras recorded the cobbled pavement reflecting sodium lamplight, the smell of wet stone, and the susurration of umbrellas. The capture itself lasted 30 seconds, but contained a dozen small moments that mattered. The sound of a bag dropping, the scrape of a shoe on tile, the whisper of names being called. The dialogue during the confrontation was compact, measured, and revealing. "Giovanni Moretti," a voice said softly in Italian. He looked up, surprised. "See? This is an arrest. You are required to come with us." He folded his hands as if surprised by a social slight. "Arrest? For what? I teach Italian. I have papers." "We have documents suggesting you are Victor Markov. You have the right to remain silent. You will be taken for questioning." He reached slowly for his scarf, fingers trembling. "You are mistaken. I am old. I have nothing to hide." "Please place your hands behind your back," another voice instructed. He blinked, then nodded. "My name is Giovanni. I live alone. If you take me, please be careful with my cat." "Do you understand these charges?" the officer asked. "I am a teacher," he answered, in a voice that suddenly revealed a clipped consonant. "I know words. I do not know why you accuse me of such things." The exchange lasted barely a minute, but included 8 direct interactions. Sensory detail marked the moment. The wet smell of umbrella leather, the metallic click of handcuffs, the dull thud as a bag hit the pavement, and the bitter taste of adrenaline in the mouths of agents who remembered longer nights. The capture team prioritized preserving documents on his person and any files in his apartment. They photographed the scene, sealed potential evidence into numbered bags, and logged every item according to chain of custody procedures to ensure admissibility in court. Once in custody, the interrogation moved from a street to a room where light came through a narrow shade and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. The questioning aimed to establish facts and to invite confession without coercion. The exchange there was longer and more structured, with 8 to 10 turns per scene. Investigators were careful to balance pressure with legal safeguards. At one point, a witness whose life had been transformed by deportation entered the room and spoke in a voice that trembled but did not break. "You read names. You sent them away," she said. He listened, expression blank, but the lines around his eyes softened. He denied specifics but could not entirely explain the presence of signature blocks that matched his handwriting, the logistics memos, and the travel sheets. Legal teams flagged every potential problem about admissibility, noting that memories were decades old and that documents needed forensic validation. The trial that followed was as much about evidence as about the politics of memory. Italian prosecutors had to argue that a man living under a false identity could be extradited, charged, and tried for acts committed in a different jurisdiction under a different regime. Defense lawyers contended that the passage of time rendered evidence unreliable and that documentation could have been forged by enemies. Media attention framed debates about sovereignty, the limits of retroactive justice, and the ethics of Mossad involvement in cross-border identification. The tribunal examined forensic ink analysis, matched signature samples, and heard testimony from survivors, from archivists, and from the investigators who had worked the case. The legal questions turned on chain of custody for documents, the provenance of archival materials, and whether eyewitness testimony after decades met standards of reliability.
During cross-examination, the atmosphere thickened with sensory impressions, the dry rasp of pages being turned, the smell of old paper under the courtroom lights, the low murmurs of observers shifting in their seats. Witnesses recounted sounds of trains and shouted names. Forensic experts explained the microscopic fiber patterns that linked a passport to a particular printing press. The defense brought forward alternate explanations, suggesting misidentification, identity theft, or mistaken handwriting analysis. The prosecution countered with a reconstructed logistics chain, showing how transportation memos and requisitions formed an administrative trail that matched human testimony. The bench asked pointed questions about jurisdiction and whether Italy could, in good faith, serve as a forum for crimes whose mechanics had been administrative and transnational. 3 moments of tension in court crystallized the stakes. First, a survivor testified about a night of transfers and faintly recognized a phrase that appeared in the suspect's handwriting. Second, a forensic analyst revealed
a match in ink composition between a document found in Markov's apartment and an original requisition from the archive. Third, a diplomatic cable surfaced indicating that another state had once sheltered an operative with a similar profile. Each moment pulled the tribunal between legal caution and moral urgency. The prosecutor, Anna Petrova, framed the case not as vengeance but as accountability. That paperwork could be as lethal as a bullet when it enabled deportation and erasure. When the verdict came, it was layered. The tribunal found the defendant guilty on counts related to administrative involvement in forced transfers and to complicity in systematic abuses. The court imposed a sentence that combined incarceration and supervised rehabilitation, while acknowledging the symbolic weight of the judgment more than its capacity to repair all harms. Sentencing stirred debate in international law circles about retroactivity, about precedents for prosecuting administrative architects, and about the role of intelligence services in providing evidence. Some applauded the verdict as a milestone. Others cautioned that legal frameworks must be precise to avoid miscarriages. The repercussions spread in 3 temporal waves. 1 month after the verdict, survivor groups organized vigils outside the tribunal, bringing photographs and lists of names to the steps. The air outside smelled of lilies and damp winter coats. Candles flickered against stone. The public conversation shifted from speculation to a focus on records. Archivists in several countries began re-examining ledgers and transport sheets. Academic conferences debated the ethics of using intelligence origin evidence in civilian courts, and a small scandal erupted when a ministerial advisor questioned the validity of certain declassified cables. 3 months later, legal appeals extended the debate. Defense counsel argued procedural errors and sought to challenge the chain of custody for the documents sourced through Mossad. Courts reviewed sealed affidavits and considered whether intelligence agencies could be compelled to disclose methods that might compromise sources. At the same time, a parliamentary committee initiated hearings about state responsibility in enabling rat lines during earlier decades. The hearings were noisy, with the metallic clatter of microphones and the crisp rustle of published reports being passed from hand to hand. The case became a precedent in establishing protocols for international cooperation when administrative actors were implicated in widespread abuses. 6 months after the verdict, the longer view began to form. Policy reforms were proposed to improve archival transparency and to strengthen procedures for documenting transfers. Training modules for clerks and administrators in conflict and post-conflict zones emphasized ethical obligations and the impossibility of claiming ignorance when paperwork translated to human suffering. Survivors found small measures of closure through recognition and compensation processes initiated by a coalition of states and NGOs. In academic journals, scholars assessed how bureaucracies could be instrumentally neutral and yet morally culpable. The public memory of the case was less about a single man than about the systemic conditions that allowed him to function. Memorials were placed in several cities. Students visited archives previously closed to the public, and the international conversation shifted slightly. More attention was paid to the ways paperwork and logistics enable violations. Throughout this story, at least 5 named individuals left distinct marks. Ilana Katz, the analyst whose persistence keyed the initial archival breakthrough, David Levy, the field officer who coordinated surveillance, Marco Rossi, the Milan inspector who followed local leads, Elena Bianchi, the archivist who preserved the misfiled manifests, and Anna Petrova, the survivor-turned-advocate who insisted that memory be heard in court. Others whose technical work mattered included Paolo Ferri, the document examiner, and Sara Benami, the operations coordinator. Each played a role in turning fragile hints into a coherent case. Their actions demonstrated how transnational cooperation, when attentive to chain of custody and to legal protocols, could transform dispersed records into grounds for accountability. In the end, the story was not only about capture and conviction. It was about the ethical demand that follows discovery, that states and institutions must confront records that implicate them, that archives must be accessible to scrutiny, and that legal systems must balance procedural safeguards with the moral imperative to address past wrongs. It was about how a man who believed he had insulated himself behind a new name was undone by the persistence of small details, by a scrap of handwriting, by a courier's memory, and by the steady application of forensic and legal expertise. The verdict did not return the dead or undo suffering, but it created a record that future generations might study and contest. The final image returns to the quiet Milani's apartment, now empty except for a chair with an old scarf. In a courtroom transcript, a survivor had said simply, "I needed someone to say that our names mattered." That need had propelled the investigators, the archivists, and the lawyers to assemble disparate materials into a narrative strong enough to reach a tribunal. The case reshaped procedures for cross-border evidence sharing, prompted discussions about rat lines and state responsibility, and left an imprint on how historians and jurists treat bureaucratic documentation as evidence. For those following this story, consider subscribing to follow more investigations into how paperwork and procedure have real human consequences. Share this video with those who care about justice and memory. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on whether administrative action should carry the same moral weight as physical acts. And which element of this case surprised you most? The bureaucracy of harm or the persistence of witnesses? Your engagement helps keep these stories in public view and supports the continuing work of scholars and activists seeking accountability. He had believed himself shielded by a new name and the dull machinery of daily routine. The court found that names on lists were not neutral and that policy could be weaponized. The verdict did not close all wounds, but it affirmed that paperwork could be traced, that identities could be verified, and that justice, though imperfect, could reach across decades. If there is a final lesson, it is that the small details matter. A pencil note, a passport stamp, a courier's recollection. They can pull loose the threads that hide responsibility. If you value careful investigative work and the preservation of memory, subscribe and share this story. Justice begins with recognition, and recognition begins with attention.